Hello, everyone, and welcome to our panel. My name is Colleen Carroll, and I serve as the NXUnite lead here at Nexus Marketing and will be your moderator for today's panel session. Our topic today is Stretch and Strengthen, Strategies for Building a Flexible and Agile Nonprofit. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation, but as usual, I have a few quick logistics to cover before we jump in. NXUnite by Nexus Marketing serves as a powerful community resource designed to foster connections and facilitate lasting relationships within the mission-driven sector. On NXUnite, you can find upcoming industry events, suggested influencers to follow, trusted solutions, and cause-driven podcasts. NXUnite also hosts webinars, demos, and of course, panels with experts such as the lovely folks here with me today. Today's sponsor of our panel is Skeleton Key Strategies. Skeleton Key Strategies is a boutique consulting firm that helps nonprofit experts in fundraising, marketing, and data operations to unlock greater efficiency, insights, and impact. They are tech, process, and operations experts with over 25 plus years of nonprofit leadership and consulting experience. Their fluency in the needs and nuances of nonprofits allows them to serve as translators, facilitators, and storytellers, helping organizations bridge the strategic gap between where they are and where they want to be. They thrive at the nexus of progressive missions, the humans who love them, and the tools they use to change the world. Skeleton Key Strategies is proudly queer-owned and operated, and thank you so much to Skeleton Key Strategies for supporting the NXUnite mission and this free educational content. Today's hour-long panel will include time both for questions curated by my team and questions from you all, our fantastic audience. So if you are joining us live at any time during the panel, please feel free to start submitting your questions in the chat or in the questions tab, and we'll get to as many as we possibly can in the second half of the session. The earlier you get those questions in, the more likely we'll be able to address them, and the more likely we'll be able to get through a larger number of questions. So if you have come into this call with a question in mind, a topic you want to make sure we answer, send that question in right now. That would be awesome. All right, if at any point anyone's having any technical difficulties, please let us know in the chat. My colleague Anton is here under the Team NXUnite username and will do his best to assist. So give a little holler in the chat, let us know what's happening, and we'll figure out how to get you back on and enjoying the session. Did also want to mention that the panel session is being recorded, so if you get to the end and the insight you heard was just so fantastic, you need to hear it a second time right away. That's awesome news. It's going to automatically be in your email inbox. Just give it a few minutes after we wrap up and you'll have access to that recording. It will also continue to be accessible on the NXUnite website if you have any friends in the industry you'd like to share it with. Finally, before I introduce today's panelists, I do want to give a big thank you to our audience, whether you are joining us live and letting us know in the chat where you're calling in from, which is awesome, or you're watching the recording tomorrow, a week from now, a month from now. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day and being part of our NXUnite community. And if you are joining us live, I hope you will submit questions so we can address the topics relevant to you and your team. All right, time to start with our introductions. I'd first like to introduce Simone Carvalho, Principal Consultant at Skeleton Key Strategies. Simone brings a wealth of nonprofit experience to Skeleton Key Strategies team with a background spanning programmatic, fundraising, technical, and operational roles at organizations including the ACLU and Jersey Cares. She has held roles from volunteer manager and fundraising officer to database support, business analyst, and product manager. These frontline experiences, such as leading an emergency volunteer response during Hurricane Sandy or managing the Salesforce product roadmap for the ACLU's 425 plus fundraising users, give her a unique perspective to solving complex challenges. Simone has also served as a Salesforce solution implementation partner, helping to design, build, and launch an integrated financial and fundraising system for the Computer History Museum in Mountain View, California. As part of CauseCraft Consulting, Simone leveraged her nonprofit expertise and SI partner experience to help Feeding America prepare for a major Salesforce migration. Simone, thank you so much for being here today. Also joining us today is Andrina Sawyer, president at Perk Consulting, an advisory firm for small to mid-sized nonprofits and businesses, and the founder of MCWEN, a network for women of color entrepreneurs. Originally from Freetown, Sierra Leone, she and her family moved to the United States when she was 9 years old due to a civil war that left thousands dead and untold numbers maimed and displaced. She now credits her family's move during the war for her interest in human triumph and perseverance. She has since actively worked to mobilize and empower others. In addition to her work with entrepreneurs and nonprofits, she is the author of several books, including The Misadventures of a New Entrepreneur, 5 Things They Won't Teach You in Business School. Andrina, thank you so much for being here today. Also joining us is Rubin Singh, president and CEO at OneTenth Consulting, a boutique consulting firm and registered Salesforce partner that works exclusively with nonprofits for their technology strategy and CRM implementation needs. Rubin is a seasoned professional with over 20 years of experience in the CRM space and over 15 years in the nonprofit sector. Throughout his career, Rubin has pursued his passion for social impact by empowering and enabling nonprofits through various roles in technology, strategy, and organizational management. Rubin is a fervent equity advocate and serves on various committees, both personally and professionally, to design and build inclusive and just systems. This is deeply intertwined with his belief that technology should be accessible, equitable, and serve the greater good. Rubin currently serves on the N10 Nonprofit Technology Network Board of Directors and the Salesforce Partner Equality Committee. Rubin, thanks for being here.
Thanks so much. Looking forward to the conversation.
Finally, joining us today is Maya Tusing, who co-founded Fairlight Advisors to help nonprofit leaders fulfill their mission with first-class financial and investment solutions, honed while working at the most respected institutions in the world. Fairlight provides nonprofits and mission-focused organizations financial planning and investment management services, customized and aligned with their financial goals. Prior to Fairlight, she was head of BlackRock's Institutional Index Allocation Group, where her team managed over $200 billion across all asset classes, investment styles, and vehicles. Over the last 20 years, she held senior risk management roles at firms such as BlackRock, Barclays Global Investors, Visa, and GE Capital. She is a graduate of Pomona College and holds an MBA in International Finance from the University of Washington. Maya, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Colleen. Glad to be here.
All right, it is finally time for me to stop talking and for me to pass it over to our panelists. And Simone, I'm going to have you start us off with our first question. What does it mean for a nonprofit to be truly agile, and why is it crucial for their success in today's environment?
Thanks. I don't think this is new to anyone on the call today, but nonprofits operate in a rapidly evolving landscape. They're subject to the same social, political, and economic factors that impact corporations, governments, and our own personal daily lives. So in the face of this constant uncertainty, it's about how orgs choose to respond to this ambiguity and that change that really defines their sustainability long-term. So when you can let go of the way things were always done and become open to revisiting requirements, preferences, and traditions, you're embracing flexibility and agility. Requirements, preferences, and traditions, I highly suggest folks do a quick Google. The Management Center talks about the differences between those 3 things. It's important to look at what we think is a requirement for doing business and making sure it truly is, or if it's just a personal preference or an organization's tradition. An agile nonprofit is open to new approaches and revisiting these things. They can quickly adapt to a change in a funding stream and take advantage of a new opportunity. If anything, I think the past 3 years has really shown in particular that nonprofits are totally able and willing to be nimble and agile and ensure that they can continue to deliver impact.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for starting us off there, Simone. Andrina, I'm going to bring the same question over to you. What do you see as it meaning to be truly agile, and why is it crucial?
Yeah, I think Simone said it best in terms of why it's crucial. It's necessary for survival for many nonprofits. think the pandemic definitely taught us that. But even prior to the pandemic, there's so many nonprofits that are dealing with scarcity of sorts, whether it's scarcity with people, scarcity with resources. And so being able to be nimble and to adjust as resources flow, as the industry changes, the climate changes, is really critical to survival. How do nonprofits do that? I think you make that part of your culture. And it starts with conversations. I think many of us would be surprised at what a really transparent and authentic conversation can do, the power of that with your board, with your constituents, with your donors, your volunteers, but starting with transparency and explaining why change management is critical, right? Everybody understanding the importance of that in culture. And then with your implementations, whether that's program development, whether that's training and capacity building, making sure that you integrate the option for people to be able to change, your programs to change, and for you to be able to pivot as well.
Thank you so much, Andrina. Before we turn over to our other two panelists, I did want to note to our audience that we have had a poll go live where we've asked you all, how do you feel about your nonprofit's current agility? If you'd like to let us know kind of where you're coming into this conversation from, please feel free to go out and fill that poll. It's just in that poll tab on the bottom bar. All right, Rubin, over to you. What do you think it means to be truly agile, and why is it important?
Yeah, thanks, Colleen. And you use the word truly agile, and I think that's a key point there. And I would agree with what Andrina had said, that about having it baked into your culture, and that's where I've seen it to be truly agile with organizations that I've worked with, where that agility or that adaptation or that ability to respond to change, it's really in the DNA of the organization. It's really part of their foundation. And I have a feeling we're going to be talking about the pandemic as examples a lot, but there were definitely organizations that I work with that were say, wow, you had that revelation right then and there, and said we need to do something. We need to shift. We need to transform. What do we do? How do we transform? What's the first step? And then there were other organizations that were like, it was about, okay, how do we execute? It was really just moving directly to execution. And it, in my opinion, in my experience, it had less to do with, maybe how many resources one organization had over another, but it was really that mindset. It was really that that principle or that value of agility. And those who had it really, embedded in their DNA were able to respond a lot quicker.
Thank you so much, Rubin. All right, Maya, I think you know what question's coming your way. What are your thoughts on true agility and how we need that in today's environment?
So playing clean up here. So, everybody really touched on many of the factors that require agility and resilience. And one thing that, similar to what Adrina was saying, is that, conversations are knowledge. It's a really uncertain time. Simone talked about it. Andrina talked about it. It's not only what we just saw, but what we're seeing now, economic uncertainty, geopolitical uncertainty, even in this country. And uncertainty means risk. And I think there's that acknowledgement that we're all vulnerable. And I've heard nonprofits who think, oh, isn't that being really negative? We want to be optimistic. Well, no, it's just being smart and having that knowledge, prioritizing what your weaknesses might be or are in the face of uncertainty, and being able to plan ahead before those things hit, instead of being reactionary and having to stem the bleeding as you're bleeding, instead thinking, how can we prevent or put controls in place to limit when those risks become events?
Thank you so much, Maya. Very quickly, I wanted to turn to that poll. Right now, we asked you all, how do you feel about your nonprofit's current agility? And 100% of you said quite adaptable, always ready to pivot. That's fantastic. If you have any insights that you want to share in the chat, please feel free to also. But to our nonprofits who maybe don't feel like they're in that category, also welcome. That's what this session's all about. All right, Maya, I'm actually going to stick with you for this next question. How can our nonprofits strike a balance between strategic planning and adaptability in today's ever-changing landscape?
So I'll kind of interpret that question in that, and a lot of nonprofits seem to think if we have to put all these planning in place to be agile, it's a waste of time. I don't have the resources. And as we all know, nonprofits survive on really thin margins. And for me, what I've seen the most effective nonprofits do is prioritize, as I said before, is what is going to have the most meaningful impact and a positive kind of upside to the organization. And, often you'll have nonprofits or even organizations that worked in big corporations where they've made this mistake, where you just boil the ocean and what are all the things that could go wrong. We can't resource all those controls. So it's really finding that select three, maybe that where we have the time, the effort, the data to control and prevent those uncertainties, and put efforts there. And we're going to have to accept a lot of risks and other things that might happen. But that can go a long way when you can focus on what's most meaningful to fulfilling the mission. I think that you're striking that balance.
Thank you, Maya. All right, Rubin, over to you. Thoughts on making that balance between strategic planning and adaptability?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think, the process in my opinion, the process for strategic planning itself needs to be flexible. So, if you're doing strategic planning, every 2 to 3 years, it's going to be difficult to be adaptable and flexible. But if your strategic plan is something that's living and breathing and evolving with the organization, then I think, and it's revisited and updated in an agile way, then I think it's going to serve the organization in more meaningful ways. Also, I would say that I don't really see it as a balance that needs to be struck. I look at it more as something that should be integrated. So, for example, in our strategic planning exercises, one of the things that we do is we work with the organization to come up with decision-making pillars that help with ongoing decision-making. And, on the technology side, often that is, how do we feel about data? Should it be more accessible to everyone in the organization or less accessible, or build versus buy, or cutting edge versus, trusted legacy systems? And we actually do a lot of this deciding upfront about, what do we feel as an organization strategically, so we don't have to keep redeciding these things throughout an implementation or throughout these projects. So if we can build some of those efficiencies and build some of that agility into our strategic planning, the two can serve each other. And it's really helped a lot of our organizations not get bogged down having to have the same discussions and same debates over and over that tend to really slow things down. And having that thought done, in a controlled environment early, helps the organization stay agile throughout. So I think there's opportunity for strategy and agility to be integrated together.
Thank you so much. Very quickly, I want to let our audience know that we have had another poll go live. If again, you want to let us know where you're coming from, we asked you all, have you ever found it difficult to balance strategic planning and adaptability? All right, Simone, over to you. Any thoughts on that delicate balance, or is it not a balance?
That's interesting. I'll say that my response is yes, applicable to strategic planning, but just in general, I'll say two things: engage early and assess often. So first, engaging early and engaging with folks differently than you may currently be engaging with them, whether it's with your strategic planning or not. Involve a wide range of stakeholders in your planning process and promote feedback loops. I think about what Adrina said early on about transparency and lots of communication. And I'm just going to emphasize that here. Don't only engage your board and your senior leaders. Can you pull in a more agile team and a process that includes a diverse stakeholder group and those perspectives? So find ways to include your staff, volunteers, clients early on and as often as you can. Because the reality is that frontline, more junior operational type folks in your organization can often tell you things or know of things that may never percolate up to senior leadership. If you truly want a holistic solution, you have to hear from everyone top to bottom. Hierarchies are just another example of a preference or a tradition and not necessarily a requirement. And it's always something that an agile org should be open to revisiting how you establish that process. And then the second thing really quick is assess often. So monitor for changes in the landscape and assess whether your current strategies need adjustment. welcome changing requirements even late in the planning process, which is super frustrating and hard. But not only should you be paying attention to external factors that might be influencing your strategic plans, but internally assess and reflect at regular intervals so you can allow for and welcome, those changing requirements I mentioned, evenly in the planning process.
Thank you, Simone. All right, Andrina, final thoughts on the balance between strategic planning and adaptability.
Sure. So I tell our clients, you keep the strategic plan straight ahead of you. Keep your line of sight on the strategic plan, but you always keep your periphery on the contingencies. And I think tunnel vision when it comes to strategic planning is that we just focus 100% on what's in front of us and what's documented. But there's so much that's out of our control when it comes to the implementation and the follow-up. For anyone who's ever done a SWOT analysis, you might be familiar with the O and the T being part of what's called an external environment assessment, meaning that you can't control the opportunities or the threats that happen. COVID, again, being a perfect example of that. And so when it comes to the implementation of your plan, if something like that happens, or your capacity or your resources suddenly drastically declines, what do? You create contingencies. So you plan as best as possible for all the what ifs. And I think that's where the agility comes in, but you stick to the plan as much as possible because you can control it. So again, I tell them, keep your line of sight on the strategic plan. Those benchmarks are important. They're objectively written down for a reason. But because, again, there's so much that's out of your control, make room for that. And that goes, back to our earlier point. I think all of us have said it, culture, making sure that it's okay to change at any time. If the reevaluation of the plan means that you don't wait until 6 months into it, but you do it at 4 months or 3 months, that's okay, because it's culturally acceptable. So I think that's, some of the ways that you can start to incorporate that.
Thank you so much, Andrina. All right, checking in on that poll, we have a 50-50 split. We said, have you ever found it difficult to balance strategic planning? 50%, yes, often a challenging juggling act. 50%, rarely, we prioritize adaptability. So thank you to those of you who filled that out. Rubin, I'm going to have you start us off with our next question. How does an organization's commitment to equity tie into its overall flexibility and agility?
Yeah. Well, thanks for that, Colleen. I think I want to reiterate a point that Simone had made earlier, and it's about reevaluating what we refer to as, best practices or the tried and true methods or these sort of conventional way of doing things. In my experience as a consultant over so many years, it's sometimes into those techniques and approaches and methodologies that have been just accepted over time, and even textbooks talk about them. Oftentimes, that is where the bias and discrimination is really embedded in that. So I think, at least for us, it's something that we're very mindful of, that we're really and being thoughtful of the approaches that we take. Also, again, from a technology perspective, we've taken some stands to where we have identified that. So, for example, to give an example of persona mapping, we've used this activity a lot in our consulting over the years of coming up with fictitious people and profiles and using anecdotes to tell us how they will behave with a nonprofit and such. And we've decided to move away from that and really focus on human-centered design instead, where we're really focusing on the individual, the human, their experience, their feelings, their opinions, their interactions, and really letting their vision design a system. But if we're going to do that, and that human who we're getting the system guidance from may not be as technical, then we also have to shift our processes accordingly. And we can't hand them 300 requirements to review. We can't give them 50 diagrams to comment on. So I know I'm sort of answering both sides of this question, that I think the nonprofit needs to understand, it needs to question their practices. But as those of us who serve the nonprofits, we have to evaluate our practices too, to make sure we're meeting the constituents where they are. And I think really that continuous learning and questioning of our practices is really where we can tie that agility and equity together.
Thank you so much, Rubin. Maya, same question over to you. How do you see an organization's commitment to equity tying into flexibility and agility?
Yeah, I'm going to redefine agility and flexibility as kind of robustness and resilience and effectiveness. and that we often think of diversity, equity, and inclusion from a staffing perspective. I think a lot of nonprofits fail to consider their boards and the diversity in their boards as well. Often there's a blinkered approach to looking for technical and financial resources, technical for any consulting that might be needed that's free consulting, and then of course donors. But often there's the gap of who are you trying, what communities are you trying to address their needs, and having them sit, representatives sit on their boards, those who've have dealt with the challenges that the nonprofit's mission is trying to resolve, have them have a voice, because they're going to give a strategic vision that may not be available on the board, and is going to be a gap in those conversations that we've talked about, that knowledge, that planning, and so that you're not only taking all views from the staffing perspective, but also at the board perspective, would be a lot more helpful in having that kind of agile strategic vision.
Thank you, Maya. All right, Andrina, over to you. Thoughts on the commitment to equity and its tie into flexibility and agility?
Sure. I think that's a great question. And for me, I'm all about conversation and communication. I think that solves, half of the problem sometimes that we have as nonprofit leaders. I would say it starts with asking the hard questions. Many times as organizations, we make our programmatic decisions based on our past performance or based on what the original founding documents say. And sometimes it's not reflective of what's happening currently. And so being able to say this no longer serves us, right? For example, I recently worked with an organization where they realized that this was an issue of racial and ethnic diversity, where they realized majority of their board were middle-aged white men. And historically, that's been okay, right, for the demographic, but they're realizing that their area, the area that they are geographically, has changed drastically since they started, a couple of decades ago. And so the decisions that are being made in the boardroom do not reflect the demographic that they're currently serving. And so, sometimes that's what the hard conversations look like. And when you have those conversations, then equity becomes a programmatic issue that you can tackle. But again, it starts with the decision making. And I would also say to nonprofit leaders, also be open to hearing externally what people are saying. So it's one thing for the board to make decisions and to be agile based on the decisions that they make internally. But if it's not reflective of the people and the people's voices aren't being heard, you have to be mindful of that as well. And not get caught in the trap of talking or serving people based just on your vantage point and your metrics, but making sure that it's really translating. And we're not just being equitable internally, but externally, it's actually evidence.
Thank you so much, Andrina. All right, Simone, I think you know what question's coming your way. What do you see as the relationship between equity and flexibility and agility?
I'm going to echo so much of what Andrina just said. I just want to say yes to everything you just said so much. My response is going to be so incredibly similar, and just touch on that little talking point I mentioned before about creating feedback loops that engage a diverse audience early and assessing often. So it's, I think we've all acknowledged, it's really easy to just stay on the path well traveled, but as Rubin mentioned, it's usually embedded with a lot of bias that was baked in the founding documents and things of that nature. And it's always so much easier to reach consensus when you silo your conversations and your decisions with those in power, which, is typically and still unfortunately dominated by white men. So those feedback loops that involve a diverse stakeholder group is a great starting point. Because I think we can all agree that every person brings a unique wisdom and perspective to work that ultimately keeps us from living in those echo chambers. But diversity without equity, inclusion, and justice is just tokenism. Agile orgs assess often to really find out if their strategy is working. And like Adrina mentioned, They're open to critical feedback and they're not scared of it. They're not running away from it. So when assessment results come back and show that you failed or that you lack the diversity you were hoping for, you have inequities in decision making, and you're still having exclusive parties, you're open to change and you can acknowledge those failures and quickly take action and adjust your strategy. You're open to customizing the tools that you have in place, your teams and processes to address inequality. And then you can go beyond diversity and find ways to offer justice, to truly fix the system, and offer equal access to both tools and opportunities.
Thank you so much, Simone. All right, I have more questions, but very quickly, I want to remind our live audience that now is the time to submit your questions. Otherwise, I will be selfish and ask all of my own questions, and I'm going to have a really great time, but maybe you'll have something lingering that doesn't get answered. So again, if you have a question, please submit it now. This is the best time to do so. All right, Andrina, I'm going to have you start us off with our next one. What role does leadership play in driving an organization's agility, and what do nonprofit leaders on the call today need to hear from this conversation?
Yeah, I mean, leaders determine the course of most things in the organization, starting with the vision. Whatever vision the leader casts, most times the organization will follow. And so starting with the vision, I think the tone of the vision, the actual benchmarks and the goals of the vision will suggest a lot about what the organization actually ends up doing. And to every leader, I'm going to pause there mid-thought, right? Because Simone said something that was so good, I had to write it down. And I think this applies to leaders. She said, agile orgs assess often. And I think that this is something that leaders actually need to put into practice. I'm going to write it down and put it somewhere on my desk. But I think leaders, agile leaders, assess often. And it starts with integrating some of these feedback loops that we've talked about. But it also starts with an assessment of yourself. Like, how in touch am I with this vision, the long-term vision, with our mission, with our current programming, and making sure that you lead by example in terms of incorporating some of that agility, and then making sure that you onboard and actively recruit people who also have the mindset for growth in the same way. There's nothing that's more frustrating, I think, for most leaders than to feel like you're being met with constant pushback and resistance from people who are stuck in their ways. And so that means that as part of your casting vision, it's not just programs, it's not just funding, it's not just the technical things that we can attach metrics to, but there's some of the nuanced things, right, that you need to make sure that your people understand as well. And it starts with you.
Thank you so much, Andrina. Simone, back over to you. What do you see as the role of leadership in agility, and what do our nonprofit leaders need to hear?
Oh man, I have lots of things to say on this. So first I'll say, I'm going to just refer to another thing that I think is useful for Googling. If you're in this session, you're probably interested in what the heck Agile is. You'll probably come across the 12 Agile Manifesto principles, which is really about product development. But I think one of them that's key and really relevant in this situation is build projects around motivated individuals and give them the environment and support that they need and trust them to get the job done. So how do you do that? I think the key term I'll use here is psychological safety. The best leaders and managers I've had in my life have provided such immense psychological safety that allowed me to thrive and succeed in those roles. I think you can create that in a variety of ways. So the first thing I would say is, to Andrina's point, like reflect on yourself and think about and analyze how are you reacting to mistakes and how are you choosing to address the contributions of your team. So the first thing, remind your folks, your team, that when you're trying new things, mistakes are inevitable. They're to be expected. They are not unforgivable offenses. It should not be like a 3 mistakes, you're out kind of thing. Leaders should also be open and vulnerable in sharing their own mistakes and owning their own mistakes. I cannot tell you how valuable it has been in my experience to have managers acknowledge when they've taken a misstep. So I can see and feel safe that, like, if they can make mistakes, I can make mistakes when I'm trying something new. Because they're able to reframe those mistakes as steps on a longer journey and treat it as a valuable learning opportunity rather than just like a penalizing moment. The other thing I'll say is that there's immense power in giving special thanks or kudos to folks who challenge the status quo, or who just are bringing up the uncomfortable issues or speaking on behalf of others. And you can recognize this as a contribution in building the group dynamic in addition to just like the tactical problem solving itself. To repeating these things over and over again builds your stature as a reliable figure. Two-way vulnerability is so crucial here. I think that's how you ultimately build trust and the psychological safety as a leader to really foster that culture and like become an agile organization. It's like putting the meat behind the words. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Simone. All right, Maya, over to you. What role does leadership play and what do our nonprofit leaders need to hear?
Yeah, I think I'm going to rant here because a lot of what we are advocating as panelists is something that takes resources. And unfortunately, I see a lot of pretty influential board members and major donors who are not willing to fund operations and infrastructure. And you'll often hear, I only give to programs, and not really understanding that everything we're talking about here needs funding to be able to deliver effective impact. And this is not just, it can be board members, it can be major donors, it can be major grantors, even at the local government level. We want to see impact. And sometimes those dollars, you're not going to see impact right away. You need to build that infrastructure. And we have this perverse, attraction to giving to nonprofits that are already well resourced. Excuse me, but the guide star, you've got five stars, and so I'm going to give you even more. But really, giving needs to be toward that platform of control, and many nonprofits don't have it. And so I'm sure I'm speaking to the choir with a lot of our attendees today who are probably beating their head against the wall with some boards who, want to get right into the beneficiaries' mouths, but really need to build up operations in the same way that businesses do. So that's my rant for today.
Thank you, Maya.
Great rant.
Lots of nodding.
It was a great rant.
Wonderful. All right, Rubin, any final thoughts on the role of leadership and what leaders need to hear?
Yeah, thank you for that, Maya. Couldn't agree more. I guess when I think of organizational agility and leadership, I guess all these stories come to mind, and I think the one that really jumps out at me is when it comes to decision making. I've had the opportunity to work with some really extraordinary organizations with some really transformative ideas, but they can't deliver simply because their inability to make a decision. Either no one is empowered to make the decision, so everything gets routed up to a leader, but then the leader doesn't want to make the decision because they don't want to be blamed, they don't want to be held accountable. So we end up in this cycle of analysis and reanalysis and presenting and representing, and let's modify the presentation, and ultimately it gets nowhere, which I think then prohibits that organizational agility. I've seen other variations of it where, organizations that pride themselves on, consensus-based decisions and, we 100% agreement on the decisions that we make. But those who are the decision makers aren't engaged enough to be comfortable in making those decisions. So there's a lot of deferring, there's a lot of delaying, there's, pushing it back down to staff who also don't want to be blamed for the wrong decision. So this sort of inability or lack of process to make decisions is where I've seen prohibit some real organizational agility. And, I know that the idea of failing fast is not really a luxury that a lot of nonprofits have. for all the reasons that Maya brought up. The alternative of waiting around for the perfect decision is also not practical. So I think this fear of being blamed for the wrong decision, or the inability to make a decision, or the lack of process around decisions is really something that is prohibiting agility. And I think that sort of correction needs to be is the tone that is set from the leader themselves. So that's something I've seen in those leaders that do set the right tone, and do take accountability for their decisions, and do encourage decision making throughout the organizations, are the ones who get this and tend to be the ones who are more agile.
Thank you so much, Rubin. All right, Maya, I'm going to have you start us off with our next one. What are the most common hurdles nonprofits encounter when striving for greater flexibility, and how can they overcome these obstacles?
Oh, thanks for having me start with this one. That communication and respect between board and staff leadership is something I see pretty common with my clients, and when I sit on boards as well, is not understanding your role as a board member and your role as a staff leadership, and making sure that those are clear. That, for example, a board should not be there judging and scrutinizing budgets to a really deep level, scrutinizing operations. I believe that really should be staff leadership to be taking that leadership role on that. And also staff leadership understanding that the board is there as a lighthouse and guiding mission, and understanding that there's going to be some kind of fluidity there, but respecting those lanes is really key to that agility, I believe.
Thank you so much, Maya, for starting us off with that one. And Drina, I'm going to bring this question over to you. What are the common hurdles, and how can we avoid them?
Yeah, so I think the first one that came to mind, to Maya's earlier point, resources. I think about the nonprofits that I've been fortunate enough to work with, some of them very, very small, and they want to embrace change as an ideal, right? They want to do that. Their people are ready, the board is ready, but to even start the conversation would require a retreat. And to have a retreat that's effective, you'd have to bring in a consultant. That can be thousands of dollars. And so when Maya is talking about how expensive agility can be, it's a real thing. And I think sometimes people misunderstand or underestimate what that really takes if you want to do it effectively. I think resources is a huge thing, but then also just a real understanding of what change management looks like. And sometimes that looks like revising things that have been in existence even longer than you probably were in the role as a leader. So we're talking about founding documents, we're talking about programming documents, even funding documents sometimes. But it takes the time, right? So financial resources, the time, again, and then just people who are forward thinking. Sometimes you'll have a mixed board of people who are forward thinking, but perhaps don't really know what it takes to be a good board leader. They don't know the roles, the responsibilities, and the functions. And then you'll have half of the board sometimes that knows exactly what the functions of the role are, but they're not necessarily forward thinking. And so as a leader, you now have to balance this and create a new culture. And again, that takes time. Sometimes that takes outsourcing, bringing in somebody else to help facilitate some of those conversations. But I would say resources, I think, is probably the biggest hurdle.
Thank you so much, Andrina. All right, Rubin, over to you. Common hurdles and how to avoid them.
Sure. Yeah, no, there's definitely going to be some themes here for sure. I think when I think about hurdles and some of my experiences, the things that come to mind is really two things and they're related. One is just lack of visibility of what happens across the organization. And then also this notion of, well, we've always done it this way. I think I don't know, maybe it's just the traditions are stronger with nonprofits. Most of my experiences with that, maybe it's like this with all organizations, I'm not sure. But even, for example, when I document an organization's process, I sometimes get pushback. Well, I told you what our process is. Why do you need to document it and present it back to us? But the truth is, seeing the process end to end visually, and being able to it really can be an eye-opening process. It uncovers the inefficiencies, the gaps, the risks, the bottlenecks, and only if we see it all together, can we really start taking steps to course correct. And sometimes this exercise, even for people who've been working at the nonprofit for years, they never even knew, well, why is it that we produce this export for so-and-so, every single day, or each staff has to be approved by this particular manager, or, what bottlenecks have been created over time. But everybody knows that, hey, this daily, fundraising report doesn't get there on time. Nobody's asking the questions of why or what's going on with the individual parts of the organization that got us here. So I think sometimes that lack of visibility, yes, between leadership and staff, some definitely between board and staff, board and leadership, but sometimes even among staff themselves. And so that's often I see a hurdle, or when you do uncover these issues, it's like, well, we've always done it this way. We're not sure, the previous executive director told us to do this, or, maybe a previous system required us to do this. But until we really sort of look at the process end to end, we're not able to uncover these inefficiencies. As far as like, how do we solve it? To me, the answer is simple. We hire more consultants. And I say that jokingly, obviously, but I half jokingly, I should say. But I do think that, like, at least with the nonprofits I work with, they're solving some really important problems out there, and they do not have the time to be looking at all the blind spots, or the experience to look at all the blind spots that we're calling out here on this panel. So I do think there's a place where consultants and experts in this area can play. The only thing I would advise is that you really work with consultants who understand the nonprofit space. One thing I'm sure of is it's the models that work for profit don't necessarily work in models for nonprofits. It's one of the reasons why we started our business, understanding how things are different. And sometimes we'll put proposals out there, and client will come back to us and say, thanks for the proposal, but we found this pro bono consultant who's going to help us with X, Y, and Z instead, and that's great, all for pro bono. But if you don't understand that the ins and outs and the nuances of nonprofits, you could be led the wrong direction too. So this is where I think consultants have a real role to play, not expecting nonprofits themselves to overcome all these hurdles. But just as long as those nonprofits really those consultants really understand the nonprofit space and have good experience there.
Thank you so much, Rubin. All right, Simone, hurdles and how we can avoid them.
I'm so glad I went right after you, Rubin, because I have to react and laugh. I think this is what makes Rubin such a great consultant. I wanted to finger snap a whole bunch in many of the things that you were saying about taking that extra step in analyzing and assessing and really truly preparing for a migration. You touched on so many of the points I was actually going to touch on. We're in very similar spheres of consulting, and this is the sweet spot. And I do agree that I know that it seems like we're trying to sell it, but we've been in your shoes in implementing, and consultants are expensive, but you're paying for the years of experience and the 10, 15, 20 implementations that they've had under their belt. So you don't have to learn those hard lessons and pay for those hard lessons. You can inherit the knowledge and be ready and properly prepared and set up for the change management that can truly make your implementation successful. The things that I was going to touch on are so similar. And this is the sweet spot, and often where clients pull us in when they realize, we have a hurdle, but we don't know what shape it is. We think it's our tech, because so many organizations are operating in incredibly old technologies. They have a limited selection, and they're inheriting processes and tech that, has just been handed out throughout the years. Who knows if it's tradition or preference or a requirement, but outdated tech can be just as detrimental as the lack of a tech platform, because they're often built to really old specifications. And it could be practices that just really no longer scale or support your strategy anymore. But that's not to say a new tech platform is going to just solve all these problems overnight. And I think that's the hurdle or pitfall a lot of organizations fall into is they think, okay, well, it's just the platform. Let me just get a new CRM and everything's going to go away and I can be more agile and respond to these data requests. But no matter how spiffy your new technology is, if you've got janky old processes and you're rebuilding it into your new system, you're just inheriting those old traditions and biases and all those problems that you had previously. So migration projects are often a catalyst for revisiting requirements and processes if you just open yourself up to that kind of critical self-reflection. Be sure to avoid the sunken cost fallacy and that tired phrase of well, this is the way we've always done things. Prepare for resistance from staff. I think Andrina touched on this. Change management is so critical. And folks don't realize it's going to be a hurdle because you can't see it at the start of a project. Embed change management practices into your projects and your strategy overall. Organizational change requires individual change. So take time to pay attention to the individuals involved in this overall project or this migration. Make time to explain the why or the business case for this change. Identify who is explicitly changing and how you're asking them to change. And most importantly, what types of change is coming. So is this just a system change? Is their job role changing? Reporting structures, compensation, the way that they've always done things, and these critical behaviors that might take place for them. Because it's imperative that if we want to get through this transition for change or get over this hurdle, you got to bring individuals from their current state, understand where they're at, bring them through the transition so they can envision the future state and get there with you.
Thank you so much, Simone. All right. Unbelievably, we are almost at the end of our hour, so I do have to have us start wrapping up. I do have one final question for each of our panelists to round us out. But before we do that, I want to let our audience know that we're about to send a survey in the chat where we ask you if you have any lingering questions. I know we didn't get to the question specifically in the chat, as well as maybe you have one in your head that you just didn't submit. Maybe it's really specific to your organization. We want to make sure we connect you with the person who can answer your questions. So fill out that survey, let us know who you want to be connected with or what the topic is so we can identify who to connect you with, and we'll make sure you get your questions answered. All right. Andrina, I'm going to have you start us off with our very final question. This is admittedly a fairly big and broad question, but it's my favorite way to end a panel. What do you see as the future for nonprofits, and how can nonprofits get ahead today?
That is a really broad question, but I see nothing but bright lights. I think that nonprofits have proven that if you are agile and you are flexible, you can survive anything. I think the last 3 years really taught us that, especially because historically we are in a space where people are under-resourced. They're under-resourced, underfunded, capacity is an issue. And with those odds, if you can survive what's happened in the last few years, it means that you can survive anything. So I think that nonprofits will continue to be beacons, in the places that we're in, doing the good work that we continue to do. And I see nothing but a bright future. And to all the leaders, it's not always the easiest job, and it's not the job that people express the most gratitude for. But keep going. I would say that as probably my final words, because we're doing, great work to the best of our ability, even with some of the odds that are stacked against us sometimes. Embrace change. The pandemic is not the last challenge that we'll have to overcome as a sector. But I think, again, if we can survive what's happened, I think we can survive anything.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Andrina. All right, Simone, thoughts on the future and how we can get ahead today?
I'm just going to keep echoing you every single time when I get pulled up. Yes, 1,000 times. The last 3 years, we've adopted so many changes as a sector and just as a planet overall. And I think there's a real opportunity for that optimism and that analysis to figure out, all these changes that we've adopted. How many of them can we stick? How many do we continue to carry on? I think one of the key things, and this is just a larger trend overall, we have to continue to offer flexible remote work options in order to remain competitive and really attract the best talent to our industry, and to continue to deliver services in the way that folks want them and need them. I think that this is just part of a larger trend overall towards human-centered design, to your point, Rubin. It's a hot topic, it's hot words and things like that, but truly I think folks are really focusing in on human centricity. And I think that's going to continue, because the only thing that is certain, to everyone's point, is that the future is unknown and there's guaranteed to be challenges and new surprises in the future. But if we can continue to focus on the humans involved, and be agile and adopt as much of the agile methodology as possible, and that you're able to. You don't have to adopt every single principle overnight. You don't have to take everything we've recommended overnight, but I think there are some small tidbits here and there as you continue to embed it, engage other folks, and assess often. You can be more resilient. You can integrate more DEI approaches into all of your work, internally and externally. The last tactical thing I'll say, if you want to take away one thing, and it's a thing I encourage all my clients and all projects, is directly from Agile methodology, which is hold a retrospective. And I think it would be really valuable for organizations who have survived the past 3 years to hold what's called a retrospective meeting. And you can Google this again. And it's about looking about what's been done, what worked, what didn't work, what can we take away, whether you decide to think about this like really longitudinally and think about all the changes that you adopted over the past 3 years and how many of them are working well, how many do we need to like readapt or just abandon so we can, anticipate the changes and surprises that come into the future.
Thank you so much, Simone. All right, Maya, thoughts on the future and how we get ahead today?
Yeah, I would agree that the last few years actually was a litmus test for a number of nonprofits. Those that were doing things right survived. Those that were struggling struggled more. And I hope it also those that are still alive understand the importance of unrestricted gifts and reserves that are really critical to those resources to build capacity. One thing I do fear is those that were struggling before the pandemic, particularly the arts, performing arts, which are still struggling. And I hope that those don't die, and that all the things that we've learned about technology and, as Simone said, remote work and our changing culture can allow some of these pockets of nonprofit sectors to continue to live on.
Thank you so much, Maya. All right, Rubin, closing us out, thoughts on the future and how we can get ahead.
Oh, great. Thanks. I echo all the comments and thoughts on optimism and appreciate that. I only see the role of nonprofits being filling greater voids than it already is filling right now. And I see the pressure mounting on nonprofits as well to exceed their impact. And so I think, how we get ahead in this sector, I believe, really has to do with these well-defined strategies and not just defining them, but as we've heard as a recurring theme on this call, reassessing them early and often. And oftentimes I'm in place to come up with technology solutions, and my clients will continue to harp on me. Well, why do you keep bringing up strategy? Well, if the technology is not following the strategy, then it's aimless and it's really not serving. It's not really serving the organization or your constituents. So I think that the theme that we've heard today is having a well-defined strategy, have it an evolving strategy that you assess often, and those organizations that can keep that strategy agile are most likely those organizations who will be more agile as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Rubin. All right, with that, we have reached the end of our panel. I want to give a huge thank you to our panelists. I know if we were in an in-person setting, there would be a round of applause. So just know that I'm sharing that emotionally with you all through the screen today, and I know our audience is as well. I do also want to give a big thank you to our audience, whether you joined us live or you're watching the recording. Again, thank you for your time. I hope you learned something that you can take with you to support the work, the already amazing work that you're doing. Let's be clear. You're doing a great job. We're rooting for you. We're supporting supporting you, and we can't wait to see what you accomplish. I do hope you will attend future NXUnite panels. We have a packed fall and winter, and honestly, we're already starting to plan for spring of panels ahead of us. So keep your eye out on the NXUnite website, the NXUnite LinkedIn, or you can even find me on LinkedIn, and we'll make sure to keep you up to date on all the sessions that might be relevant to you and your team. We have marketing sessions, measuring impact, Giving Tuesday, and more. So keep your eye out. Finally, I'd like to give a big thank you to today's panel sponsor, Skeleton Key Strategies. Again, thank you for supporting this free educational content. All right, that is it for me. Again, a huge thank you to our panelists, and I hope you all have a nice rest of your day. Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Goodbye.
Thank you all.